On this episode of Axel Arigato Talks, I'm delighted to be joined by Alice Aedy, who is a documentary photographer, campaigner and filmmaker who dedicates her life and work to raising awareness for issues which so often go unpublicised. Super excited to talk to you. Thank you for finding the time.
Thanks.
You are a documentary photographer, filmmaker, campaigner and all-round fab gal about town. Tell me about how you got involved in your line of work.
I guess it all started once I left uni and I started to document the refugee crisis. I'd studied history and politics and it was 2015, so if you can take your mind back there, it was the height of the refugee crisis. And I started to document it through photography and film, and I guess very, very quickly realised the power of human stories. This was a time when refugees, it was such a politicised issue. It was, it would go on to have Brexit, and the immigration conversation would have such a disproportionate place in our political conversation. But, the language of the time was David Cameron talking about swarms of migrants crossing the Mediterranean, and it was highly politicised. So I sort of saw the power of really humanising stories and really the power of portraiture, which is something that's carried me years on, to humanise the people behind headlines. The numbers and statistics that we hear kind of so reductive ultimately, and we become so desensitized to seeing the same familiar images of refugees crossing the Mediterranean. And that work has brought me, many years later. Just recently I was on the Ukrainian border, and I hadn't actually done a refugee story in quite a long time. I'd focused on the refugee crisis for about 4 years. It would then lead me on to climate change. But yeah, most recently I was on the Ukrainian border.
What was that like? Did you, as soon as the news of the war broke, did you have this inherent need to go and document?
That's a really good question. I think whenever these stories are unfolding, you want to do something. I think we all do. You're desperate to know how you can help. And in my case, it is through storytelling. So I got a call, and I think I knew the moment the name of the person calling sprang up on my phone. I was actually in Brazil doing another story. I was meant to be there for a few days more, and I saw this name come up on my phone, and I thought, okay, this might be the Ukrainian story. And it was the Thursday, and the war had broken out on the Monday, and I was invited by National Geographic to do a project there on the border, documenting refugees and IDPs. It was an easy decision to make. I had to make the decision in about an hour. There's a pang of fear and adrenaline. You have no idea. The situation is changing minute by minute, so I didn't know whether I'd be safe or what the situation was. I would just be on the border. I would be safe. But I went home, had a 36-hour journey home, packed my summer gear for a flak jacket, a helmet, the warmest layers I could find, a sort of Arctic jacket, which I waddled around in looking like a penguin, and I headed to the border.
God. And what did you step into?
Chaos. It was a rapidly unfolding situation. War broke out on the Monday, so hundreds of thousands of people decide we have to leave. So I met with people who are leaving already bombed cities, many that hadn't themselves seen violence yet, but were fleeing ahead of time. It was total panic. It's an unfolding humanitarian crisis situation. What I did see was an incredible volunteer response I was on the Polish-Ukrainian border. Incredible.
From locals?
From locals. Polish primarily, but then, people who'd driven from like Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, holding signs saying, I have a spare room, come, which was really heartwarming to see. And it's probably a bit of a cliche, but always in these situations, you see the best and worst in humanity. So incredible volunteer response. But at the same time, there were 2 Nazi rallies of Polish to basically confront the non-Ukrainians coming out. A lot of racism at the border.
To send them back?
To send them back. So imagine, for those students, many of them African students, they have fought their way onto trains to leave the country, often sent back to the back of queues. They fought their way to safety. You arrive on the border and you're met with Polish Nazi rally. So it was a mixed bag. And I say you see the best and worst in humanity. For me, having, as I said, documenting the Syrian refugee crisis a few years earlier, to see the difference in the response was really shocking. And I think that holds a mirror to us, and it's a lesson we really need to think very deeply about. How can you celebrate the extraordinary response of Europeans? Millions of refugees within weeks have just been absorbed into Europe. with the Syrian refugee crisis, much, much smaller number of refugees. The same borders who've opened their doors and let Ukrainians through were beating Syrians with batons. So the hypocrisy and the double standard has been, a bitter pill to swallow, for sure. And I think we need to think about that really deeply.
And speaking about the Syrian crisis that you were privy to, I read that there was a photo you'd taken of a Syrian refugee that was actually on the front cover of The Guardian, and it went along with a campaign for fundraising, is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
The campaign raised more money than any campaign in history, which was amazing. That's, a particularly sort of heartwarming chapter for me, because by that point I'd spent about a year documenting the refugee crisis. And I think it was a turning point because it gave me the confidence actually to call myself a photographer, a photojournalist, and a filmmaker. There's something, I wish I hadn't spent so long needing the confidence and other people's approval, but I'm 22 at the time, I think. It's completely uncharted territory. It's a really male-dominated space. And it took me too long to sort of call it myself, but I remember that because it finally gave me the confidence to say, I can do this.
And at 22, it's kind of wild. How did you navigate that at such a young age? Because to me, I'm very green when it comes to this. I get scared going through border security in a normal situation. So to approach that at 22 years old and lead the charge and lead the documentation and the media coverage for it in your own way, where did you look to for, I don't know, like a helping hand or a chat?
I think ultimately, and this is something I still navigate now, it's not really about me, it's about the people that I'm documenting. And so, I think placing myself in it was something that I actually didn't really know how to navigate at the beginning. I think I probably had a lot of guilt, which I now sort of shift into a sense of responsibility to use the privilege I have, the ability to tell stories and ultimately know my role and know what I can offer. So when there is a crisis like Ukraine, even if it's a drop in the ocean and clearly makes no difference really tangibly, I have to do something. And so knowing my role, I have been very lucky to have amazing mentors actually. And I'm always talking to people about, find mentors and connecting people, because I've had incredible mentors, one of which right now is in Kyiv on the front line in Ukraine, doing the really dangerous work, doing the reporting for the New York Times, risking her life every second, bombs dropping 20 yards away from her. So there are people doing much, much more dangerous things than me, and I've looked to them for advice. And also, I think I've always asked questions, I've always been pretty curious. And even if I thought it would make me sound stupid, I've always asked questions and sought advice.
The best way to do it. And did you meet these mentors in your travels? On the front lines?
I met Lindsay actually through a photographer. I bounded up to him. I'm mortified now thinking back to it, but it was right in the early days of me documenting the refugee crisis. And I was a self-taught photographer. I'd studied politics. It was kind of new territory for me. And I bound up to this guy, Danny Castro, an incredibly talented photographer who I later became friends with. But he was holding this camera and it looked like it come from another planet. I now know it's a medium format film camera, but I had no idea what it was.
What does that look like?
It was like a Mamiya. It's like a blocky thing. You look down like that to take the photo. And
it's like a box?
It's like a bit boxy, kind of shot on analog film, medium format, so bigger than a kind of 35mm negative. And with all the enthusiasm in the world, I think I bounded up to him and I was like, hello, I'm Alice, I'm learning to take photos, and I go up to him and ask for his advice and ask him about his project. And obviously I knew how to take photos at the time, but it was, one of those people I was asking for advice. And we stayed in touch. And about a year later, he found out that Lindsay was looking for an assistant. Yeah. And so Lindsay Adario, this photojournalist whose biography I'd read, I'd underlined the pages, highlighted the words, I became her assistant, and through her have learnt a great deal.
So you two would travel together?
I've travelled, archived her work, been she's so much. Now I sort of work alongside her on projects, which is amazing. But back then, I went from assistant, but she's been an incredible mentor to me.
She sounds incredible.
She is.
Tell me about Choose Earth, which is an incredible initiative.
Oh, thanks. So Choose Earth is, to describe Choose Earth, I kind of have to chart back a bit. I document the refugee crisis, really was tunnel vision on that for about 4 years. And somewhere along the way, I start to engage with the issue of climate change. Never had done. Wasn't one of these people at school who was like recycling, not at all. Someone who understood climate change as something happening to nature and the environment as if that was somehow separate to us. I didn't understand how, as someone who cared about human rights and social justice, it was relevant to me. But learning more about the refugee crisis, I learned that climate change will cause the biggest mass migration in history. So if I care about refugee rights, I had to care about this umbrella issue that would exacerbate these social justice issues that we care about. If you care about racial injustice, if you care about refugee rights, if you care about gender rights, you have to care about climate change because it will ultimately intersect with all of those issues. And that was like, boom, penny drop moment, my life changes.
And in layman's terms, just to break it down for me, mass migration through the cause of climate change, that's literally the world heating up and it being unlivable, so people have to migrate.
It's a mixture of the planetary outcome, so as you say, like the planet literally heating up, but also the impact on politics, on inequality, on creating conflict. So as things become more unstable, as things become more unpredictable, we're going to have conflict over resources. We're going to have more right-wing governments. As huge population shifts occur, what will happen with Europe? We're likely to build higher walls, have more militarized borders, justifying that because of migration, that's what we need. And as I said right at the beginning, the Syrian crisis had a majorly disproportionate impact on conversations in the UK around immigration. Be highly politicized, and the UK took very, very few refugees in the end. But yes, climate change will be shaped by all of this. And as one of my favorite writers says, you know, everything in the next few decades will happen in the theater of climate change. We don't know, I mean, everything about the civilization that we've built, this incredible world, these incredible societies, has been built in a period of ecological stability, a kind of Garden of Eden-like historic period that we have arrived and fundamentally disrupted. So yeah, we've fucked it up. I'm glad we could swear. You should have told me we could swear.
Oh yeah, swear away. Yeah, completely fucked it up.
So we have pretty much fucked it up, and we're going into uncharted territories. And I think that's the thing to understand. We don't really know what's coming down the line or how things will turn out. But for sure, it's instability, it's conflict. And when I realized that, I realized I had to turn my attention to this issue that I'd never engaged with, that I felt was, you know, for hippies and environmentalists, people that I didn't see myself as being anything like.
But it's actually threat number one, really, isn't it?
For me, yes, it's the umbrella issue. It encapsulates everything, and ultimately we will all have to care. And some people care because they are passionate about animals. Some people care, like me, because my entry point was social justice issues. Everyone has their way of framing it for it to really hit home, and I think for so long it's felt really far away, distant, both in time and as if it's happening to other people. But it's not. It's happening today. It is happening certainly to disproportionately the global south, but will ultimately impact us all. And when I realized that, and that truly, really landed, I really shifted my focus to climate stories. But within that, to human stories. Because we love David Attenborough, obviously.
Yeah, we love him.
He's an icon.
Ledge.
But, and he's done so much. He's made us fall in love with nature. But what's missing from that storytelling is exactly this. Whereas the human stories, the social justice impacts that I think are so important to get people to engage with this issue and make it feel relevant for them.
Wow. Wow. I'm learning so much. In terms of travel being like an educational tool, which I think it really, really is, where have you been to where it has completely, your perception has done a 180? Where you thought you were stepping into a situation, crisis or otherwise, just around our beautiful Earth? Where have you stepped into and you thought, I had absolutely no idea it was like this, that the people were like this, that the culture was like this?
I think it has to be my recent work in Brazil, which is actually linked to what you mentioned, Choose Earth, which I totally missed out on saying, but I recently been working with indigenous communities across Brazil. That's kind of blown my mind because it's taught me that a different value system fundamentally exists. Indigenous communities, and this is a fact that never seems to get less mind-blowing, are 5% of the world population, but they protect 82% of global biodiversity.
What?
Crazy. So these amazing communities are protecting and fighting for the future of our planet. And in many ways, though it feels very distant, what's happening in Brazil, we speak of the Amazon, but we all too often fail to talk about the people protecting the Amazon. So the Amazons are not just the lungs of the earth, they're also the heartbeat, and who are the people who are protecting that land. When you go to Brazil, where there is rainforest, it is indigenous protected territory.
And something that we don't understand in terms of the media representation of it is people actually inhabit that area.
People are living there. It's been their home for generations, way
so
before
the whole thing needs
colonization.
Reframing.
Totally needs
Yeah.
reframing. Not least because, you know, indigenous communities and those people are the guardians of the biodiversity in which we are enjoying and that we all too often take for granted. Our culture, a Western culture and extractive culture, has destroyed that biodiversity, and they have done everything ancestrally for decades, for generations, to protect it.
Yeah.
So why is it relevant to talk about indigenous communities? Because without them, we really don't have a chance at saving the planet. And they are hugely underfunded, hugely under-recognized. There are loads of stereotypes around them. And, you know, I've done a deep dive into this just 2 years ago, but now I've realized that every story that I've done somehow has led me to this point. You know, it's human stories, it is environmentalism and social justice is literally embodied in their struggle. And I've learned a huge amount from them.
What are they like?
Well, they have a completely different value system that is not extractive, that gives back to the land. They have an incredible relationship with nature. There are hundreds of those communities. They all have different traditions and songs and mythologies and traditional paint and clothes. They are truly extraordinary and not really taken seriously enough, I think, as the real climate leaders, and they should be. And I hope that this issue that may feel really abstract, and, you know, I can understand why would people in London feel that it's relevant to their everyday lives, but I cannot impress upon anyone how fundamentally important they are.
I think it's a lot of unlearning, because naively, when I think of the Amazon rainforest, I thought of it as like a barren waste, not a wasteland, but barren for sure. And I thought it was just not inhabited by many people at all, and then Shell would come and rip another part out, do what they needed to do and go on their merry way. The same way that I think there needs to be a lot of reframing towards climate, for example. I read something recently where, like, the oil companies and the people that are causing the most harm to the earth have pinned it on us as consumers, e.g. use only recyclable materials. You know, it's really, they're almost shifting, displacing the, you know what I'm saying? Displacing it, yeah, and being like, it's your problem, as long as you recycle, we can go willy-nilly over there.
So much has to change about the way that we talk about climate change.
Yeah.
So you're totally right. One of the most successful BP campaigns ever is to invent the concept of the carbon footprint, which is insane. And in so doing, you know, it's such a clever PR stunt. We suddenly become utterly focused on the individual, when who should we really be holding to account is corporations and governments.
So we're like the faux perpetrators.
Totally.
Okay.
And of course, there's stuff we can all do. There's no doubt about that. And ultimately, it does become about consumption. You know, it's not just a climate crisis. It is a crisis of consumption. We should be buying less. We should be buying better. We should treasure what we own. There's no doubt we can do things as individuals, but ultimately the pressure has to be put on governments and corporations. And it's so cleverly been spun on us. And then within the climate movement, you have people within the movement with, you know, bigger fish to fry, essentially, pointing fingers at each other, saying, oh no, but you're flying and you're doing X and you're doing Y. And I think the problem with that has been, we can't get people with social currency in our world, artists, musicians, celebrities, actors, to talk about this issue because they are so terrified of getting called out and being called a hypocrite.
And
I
which
think
happens very often.
it happens all the time.
Yeah.
You know, I can tell you from personal experience as someone who talks about these issues, it happens to me.
So people have turned around to you and said, how can you do this and then fly?
Oh, 100%, but more than that. I mean, 2 weeks ago I was photographed in a bluebell field, had no idea that bluebells are an endangered species, and for 4 days got...
What, berated?
I don't know, I found myself in like a dark corner of the internet getting called a murderer, an entitled bitch, everything under the sun, because I trampled on these bluebells. And the funniest bit, I mean, actually, it really wasn't funny at all, but, you know, it's like we have major issues and I'm trying to talk about them and then I get cancelled for walking on
But do you find yourself second-guessing because of the work you do?
Definitely. I mean, you know, you're filled with self-doubt, of course. I think we all are in the current environment, and social media and the climate movement can be really savage, but, you know, ultimately, what can you do?
How have you found the role of social media in terms of, like, amplifying your work?
I think social media, particularly in the past few years, has been incredible. Not just in my work, but for the movement in general. So in the pandemic, I was forced as we all were, into isolation. Suddenly, you know, I would have normally packed my camera bag and traveled to go to where a story was, and I'm forced into excruciating stillness, which I'm not very good at. But it forced me to be creative in a different way. So with two co-founders, we set up a platform called Earthrise and started to do climate storytelling in a totally different way. You know, it was a moment where social media was being used, infographics were spreading like crazy, and I feel like the conversation, you know, in a post-George Floyd world, the conversation around social justice was really gaining the traction, importantly, that it needed. And this spread into the climate movement, conversations around climate justice, this movement to reframe climate change not just as an environmental problem, but as a social justice and human rights issue, was super welcome to me, and you know, we need more of that. So social media has been an incredible tool, not least for the incredible, you know, the activists who have platforms but need a way bigger voice than they were getting. I think it's been an incredible moment in time.
Yeah, and then in terms of campaigning, which you do, what are your thoughts on, for example, Extinction Rebellion, where it's sort of shop campaigning?
No, well, in the early days of Extinction Rebellion, I got involved and I really saw the power of direct action. And I think the thing about XR is, well, I don't know which way to say this. They've, I think, failed to adapt and failed to change in the way that has been demanded of them. But what I do understand about them is they don't seek to be liked, and I think that's what people don't understand is, you know, you're not going to get us on board by blocking streets and blocking. Their aim is not to be liked. Their aim is to cause disruption, to kind of shake us by the shoulders and say, wake the fuck up. This is happening. And I think to some degree that's worked. I think they've made some major mistakes along the way. And when it comes to me personally, I was, you know, really supportive of their work at the beginning. Ultimately, I think it was me working out, what can I offer this movement? How can you best serve this movement? And for me, that's through storytelling.
I see. I want to touch, before we wrap up, about the films that you've made. Wasn't it quick?
So quick.
I want to talk about the films that you've worked on. One of them debuting San Francisco Film Festival?
Yes, in Sheffield. Yeah.
And Sheffield. Tell me about that one.
Yeah, Disconnected was a short film, one of my first really, shot on 16mm film, and it was about the loneliness epidemic. I found out that the UK had elected a minister for loneliness.
I had no idea.
And I couldn't believe that. It sounded like a sort of Orwell novel, a dystopian world.
And what do they do?
Well, they deal with the mental health crisis, which is that, you know, we are not just, it's not really about isolation, but that we feel fundamentally disconnected from each other. And so we set up a answer phone machine where young people could leave voicemails and talk about their experiences. And it was really beautiful. We sort of shot more staged, you know, beautiful, I hope, visuals, but the voice that you hear is these really intimate, personal accounts of how people are feeling. And something about, you know, I would be the first person to shove a camera about 3 inches from your face. That's normally the work that I'm doing. But with this, to not film people and just allow them the privacy of leaving that answer phone message, I felt people spoke so freely, and it was so intimate.
Less boundaried.
Totally.
Speaking of loneliness, it's isn't it in Japan where you can rent cuddles?
Can you?
Yeah, you can do that.
Should we go to Japan?
Should we go to Japan and rent a cuddle? Yeah, you can do that. There are places where you can actually go and rent time for a cuddle. Wow. None of the, you know, rumpy-pumpy. It's just pure, like, intimacy. They have a real problem with loneliness in Japan.
I think it is endemic, not just to the UK. But apparently UK is one of the most lonely countries in Europe. So.
Wow. Well, I don't feel lonely talking to you. And on that note, Alice Aedy.
What a line.
I know.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on Axel Arigato Talks. It's been a pleasure.
It's been awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.